Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on water and planning. This is a webinar that is being hosted by the Water and Planning Network of the American Planning Association in conjunction with the Alliance for Water Efficiency. This is our first webinar and what we hope will be a series of webinars that talk about water and land use. But before we go into our topic area, I just want to give you a little bit of logistical instructions. My name is Mary Ann Dickinson. I'm the president and CEO of the Alliance for Water Efficiency, and I'm really pleased to be helping host this webinar today. As advertised, the webinar will be 60 minutes in length. We have adjusted time for questions, and so we're hoping as you think of questions that you will type them in as we go along. If you're hearing my voice, you figured out the audio. It is through your telephone or your computer audio and speakers. Both options work. Your GoToMeeting invite should have both options for you to choose. As you probably already know, the phone line is being muted during this webinar presentation because we are recording the webinar and we will make the recording available to all of you after it's ready. But that doesn't mean we don't want you to participate. We'd love to have you type in questions throughout the webinar, which we will answer at the end with our speakers. The way you access the chat box is look in the upper right-hand corner of your computer screen. You'll see an orange rectangle with a white arrow. When you click that open, it will open a dialog box where you can type in any question that you have for a speaker as we go along the way. So please feel free to do that. We'd love to have your questions at the end of the webinar. Just want to say a few words about the Water and Planning Network. I have the privilege of co-chairing it together with Bill Sesenick. And this is a free network of water and land use professionals that was created by the American Planning Association, but you don't have to be an APA member to join it. You know, all you need to do is sign up and we'll be happy to include you in the group. The purpose of the network is to showcase how drinking water and wastewater utilities can work much more cooperatively with the land use professionals and committees in their communities, and to make sure that the planning is done cross silos. Right now we have about 450 Water and Planning Network members. We had a conference a couple of years ago in Kansas City called Water and Planning Connect. There will be a conference next June that's being hosted by the American Water Resources Association on water and land use. Sign up for our mailing list and you'll get all this information about what's going on. So to join, all you need to do is email water@planning.org, and that email will come to us and we'll add you to the mailing list and you'll get newsletters and other update information. So again, we're happy to be hosting this webinar for the Water and Planning Network, and we hope to be doing a whole lot more. But today we've got a fabulous presentation for you. Our first webinar is going to be a killer webinar. This is a presentation entitled Ensuring One Water Delivers for Healthy Waterways, a framework for incorporating healthy waterways into one water plans and projects. And we've got three terrific speakers who are going to talk to us about it today. Jennifer Walker is the Deputy Director for Texas Water Programs of the National Wildlife Federation. She has 18 years of experience focusing on water policy issues in Texas, with an emphasis on water planning, water conservation, and bay and estuary protection. She has considerable experience working on water policy and resource issues, and she strives to work collaboratively and approach resource management challenges with a solution-oriented perspective. Next, we have Sarah Dieringer. Dr. Dieringer is a senior researcher at the Pacific Institute, where her work focuses on water-smart cities and multi-benefit water management. She has conducted research both domestically and abroad on watershed health, long-range water demand forecasting, and integrated water management. And finally, we have Carrie Thompson, who is the Director of Operation at the Meadows Center for Water and the Environment. She is a recognized leader in natural resource administration, stakeholder partnerships, and creative solutions-oriented conservation delivery. With a multidisciplinary background in the physical and biological sciences, conflict resolution, and natural resources policy and administration, she has served in leadership roles for and as a technical advisor to stakeholders, federal agencies, and state and local tribal governments in some of the nation's most complex environmental challenges. So I will turn it over to Jennifer.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My dog literally just started barking, so hopefully she's done. That's such as working at home. So we're happy to be here today with a group of peers that are as invested as we are in comprehensive water management. Today, we're going to go over our new report, Ensuring One Water Delivers for Healthy Waterways. We have developed a framework that will help communities meaningfully include healthy waterways as an outcome in water supply planning. I want to acknowledge that this work is made possible through the generous support of the Cynthia and George Mitchell Foundation. They are longtime supporters of all of our work at all three of our organizations, and we really appreciate them and their investment in this space. We are excited to be presenting this work to the APA Water and Planning Network. This group has been a great resource. I went to the conference in Kansas City that Mary Ann mentioned and had so many light bulb moments. I really enjoyed it, so I'm really excited to be presenting to you all. As we participate and observe planning efforts across our state, it is clear that when planners and water managers work together early, the outcomes are better and the implementation goes smoother. That's one of the reasons that I think this conversation is going to be especially valuable today. I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Sarah Derringer, so she can talk about multi-benefits and why they're important, and then I'll pick it back up after her.
Great, thanks, Jennifer. Can we go to the next slide, please? Great, thank you. So thanks, Jennifer, for providing the initial introduction on this. As Jennifer mentioned, we've been really interested in this idea of how planning can achieve multiple benefits and how we can have planning that really involves communities and leads to outcomes that are beyond just water outcomes, but all of these additional things that we want out of our investments. So I'm showing here an example of some work that the Pacific Institute did over the last year, looking at stormwater capture specifically and thinking about how our investments in stormwater capture in the state of California have led to multiple benefits and multiple outcomes and achieving objectives. So I'm showing here funding from a statewide proposition that went towards stormwater capture in the state, and this is Southern California, and the benefits that were achieved by those investments. So each circle is a different project that was put into place. And we were looking at how do we quantify the value of these benefits. And what we noticed was that while there are certainly a lot of water supply benefits, because that was largely the goal of this funding source, there also were huge benefits to flood control, to water quality, to communities, habitat, and more. And you can see in some of these circles that some of the benefits are entirely to either habitats or entirely to communities. And so this got us really starting to think about how do we more systematically consider these benefits that can come from our water investments, but then also what are the potential trade-offs and how do we make sure that we're getting all of the benefits that we're hoping to get. Next slide, please. So this led us to think more broadly about what is a multi-benefit approach to water management. What would it mean if we looked at every potential benefit or trade-off of these different strategies that we're pursuing, and then be able to compare them apples to apples? And so what we developed was a framework that includes these 5 themes of benefits and trade-offs for water management. Benefits to water, including water quality, water quantity, and flooding. Benefits to energy and both energy use as well as energy production potential. Benefits to the environment, including habitat and biodiversity. To people and communities and how investments in water can really benefit our local economies, benefit health and safety, and then finally risk and resilience, and thinking about how these different project options might be able to impact our resilience, both to kind of traditional risks as well as our deeper understanding of building climate resilience. Next slide. And as Jennifer mentioned, we've been really interested in how does this fit into planning over time, and how does this fit into the way that we think about decision making. And so what we've put together is a 4-step process that's pretty broad and flexible, but meant to mirror traditional planning trajectories. So first, looking at envisioning projects and programs. Second, around identifying the potential benefits and trade-offs of those programs. And I want to point out in this step 2, it's around identifying the broad benefits and trade-offs and not worrying yet about whether we need to quantify those benefits. Third, around characterizing the benefits and trade-offs and really trying to put a number to them. And then finally, around how do we inform decision makers about what we've learned about the benefits and trade-offs of these potential water management objectives. And the goal here really was to provide the contours of thinking through how do we achieve what we want to out of our water management and planning. This framework is meant to be really modular and flexible. So as you'll see in the rest of our presentation, this provided the contours of what we're talking about, but we've really dug deeper into applying it for a specific objective. It really centers around supporting stakeholder engagement, which Carrie will talk about more later in the presentation. And the goal was really to center equity as part of this decision-making process. Next, please. So just to give a brief example of how multiple benefits can lead to changing how we invest in water. I'm showing here an example from Austin, Texas, looking at rainwater capture on residential properties. And the city of Austin was already investing in stormwater rebates that included water infiltration through rain gardens as well as cisterns. And what the city did, 2 different departments in the city decided to do was figure out how to do a collaborative rebate between Austin Water and the Watershed Protection Department, so that a resident could install both a rain garden and a cistern and receive a rebate that included both of those at the same time. And then we also started to think about what are the other benefits of doing these types of programs, and what does that mean for then connecting that with other city departments who might be interested. So for example, we modeled what was the impact on urban heat island effect of installing more trees as part of this program, and could show what the carbon benefit of that would be, as well as reduced air conditioning and energy use within the home. And this led us to be able to say what potential collaborations can exist in this one project. And I think that's particularly important as we're thinking about collaboration between land use planning and water management planning and others, about how do we figure out what are the benefits to all of us of these projects and really lay those out. Next, please. And the other piece of this was then to add in additional funders. So for example, urban forestry providing money for new trees. Next, please. So I've given kind of the broad overview of what a multi-benefit approach might look like, but I think there's also these broader benefits of looking at multiple benefits. And I've provided here some of the outcomes that we see coming from using an approach like this. First is that it can provide a more objective basis for comparing water management options. So like I mentioned with the stormwater project we were looking at, it was really challenging for us to actually compare project to project unless we're looking at the many benefits and trade-offs next to each other. It then can help us to optimize investments of our time, money, and resources into these programs that actually can provide the greatest benefit for our communities. It can also help us to identify opportunities to share costs and build that collaboration that's needed among many different beneficiaries and city departments and both public and private partners. And it also can provide an opportunity to think about what the community really needs and wants out of our investments, and thinking about how does that help us build community support for our project. And then finally, we see this approach as a way of increasing equitable investments in and mitigating the adverse impacts of our water and land planning. And I think this really is at the crux of what Jennifer is going to talk about in just a moment, which is that sometimes we can have plans that want to achieve a certain outcome. So for example, healthy waterways, but we really need to make sure that we're consciously including that in how we plan, how we think through achieving those goals, and making sure that when we're doing these plans that they actually can achieve what we want to. And so with that, I'll hand it over to Jennifer to talk through how we used this approach to ensure One Water can deliver for healthy waterways.
Thanks, Sarah. All right, so I'm going to dig into the report that we just released, and you may notice that the report that Sarah was showing also has been recently released, and we really see them as very complementary to each other and can be used together. So you're going to hear us talk about One Water a lot, and I'm sure most folks are familiar with that, but if you're not, it's really integrated water resource management. And it's looking at all the different waters in your community and how they can all be used to serve your community. That's a very, very simple explanation. It's more complicated than that. But so we believe that One Water provides us a pathway to expand water management beyond water supply to achieve healthy waterways and other community benefits. This is why we, as nonprofits and as advocates, are engaging in the One Water dialogue, considering how One Water can be deployed effectively and supporting implementation efforts. We're really involved at many different levels here. So what do we mean by healthy waterways? Many of our communities are built along creeks, streams, rivers, springs, bays, and estuaries. And within and around these resources are all kinds of ecological bounty. In addition to sustaining the species and ecosystems that make our communities unique, these waters also provide vital services to human populations and have benefits far beyond what we take from them. Maintaining water quality and ensuring that the water needed for fish, wildlife, riparian, and upland habitats is available is a critical piece of a balanced planning effort for a community or region. A water supply that incorporates healthy waterways protection is a stronger water plan overall. In order to address water supply challenges, cities have been prioritizing innovative technologies to create, quote, new water by capturing and reusing water that historically would have had a single pass through the city's system before re-entering the waterway. While One Water projects such as runoff capture and reuse practices have the promise of decreasing other water diversions, particularly if coupled with more efficient water use, achieving the One Water goal of maintaining healthy waterways is only possible with a comprehensive consideration of the impact of water management strategies on the overall watershed. Embracing healthy waterways as a component of your community's water supply planning efforts can also help avoid unintended consequences and future uncertainty for your community. Failing to proactively plan for healthy waterways can result in impaired waterways and increase the likelihood that more species will be listed as threatened or endangered. Water bodies may fail to meet applicable water quality standards, and streamside recreational value and amenities could be impacted. Each of these outcomes increases the likelihood that water management decisions will have to be revisited, resulting in increased cost, additional unpredictability, and the loss of public trust. No one wants that. So we're going to be talking about how to incorporate this as we move through our planning process. So next slide, please, Marianne. So I want to give you a little background on how we got here and why we did this work. Through our organizations, Sarah, Carrie, and I have all been involved in water planning and urban water management. Sarah and her team have been looking at One Water and how to define and quantify the multiple benefits. Sorry, something just happened on my screen. Okay. That can be realized through implementing One Water practices. And she just described this work. Meanwhile, I've been deeply involved in water planning in Texas and supporting water conservation and efficiency as an important strategy to close the gap between meeting our future water needs, thus allowing us to leave water in our rivers and aquifers to support fish and wildlife habitat. I also have hands-on experience in One Water from serving as the vice chair for the Water Forward Task Force in Austin. Our task force worked closely with Austin Water and other city departments to develop our city's 100-year water plan. And Cary has facilitated numerous watershed-scale planning efforts with multiple stakeholders. Some of these have been focused on undoing problems that our water management decisions have created for rare and endangered species and habitats. She's served as a federal mediator on these issues and has been training leaders in the use of collaborative processes, independent science, and stakeholder engagement. So we all come from slightly different perspectives, but quickly put our brains together to gelled on this issue as something very important to work on. So based on our collective experience, we determined that we needed to think specifically how One Water and healthy waterway outcomes could be woven together. There are implicit environmental benefits to using One Water strategies because it can often lead to less need for surface water or groundwater supplies, thus leaving that water in a river or aquifer. But what if we explicitly include healthy waterways as a planning outcome? By doing this, we can have lasting positive impacts. Our first step in doing this work was to assess what, if anything, was being done already along these lines. We did a survey to assess whether the One Water approach was realizing its potential to meaningfully ensure healthy waterways. We spoke with utility staff, planners, engineers, and scientists involved in One Water planning and implementation. We found that, in general, quantified assessments of One Water impacts to rivers were not included in the existing planning efforts, particularly during the critical early planning stages. We also heard that it was a challenge to define waterways for a particular community and that there was no clear guidance on how to incorporate these concepts into a typical planning process. With that in mind, we put our heads together to develop a One Water planning framework specifically designed to help planners consider and incorporate healthy waterways in their community water planning efforts. We released our preliminary findings in September 2019 at the One Water Summit, and we are here today to share our resulting framework with you. This picture here is our first report that we put out, which was the result of our survey of the different water utilities. You can see this online. I also want to note that I've looked over the list of attendees for this webinar, and I'm not sure if all the folks are actually here today, but several of the people that we interviewed for this registered for the webinar, and I want to thank each of you for taking time to speak with Cary and I last year about this work and about your experience with their One Water planning processes in your community. It really helped inform our work. Next slide, please. So based on our 2019 work, we determined that there's a need for a framework to assist communities in implementing One Water in a way that optimizes water supply to cities and keeps water flowing for our creeks, rivers, and bays to support healthy fish and wildlife and their habitats. As Sarah mentioned, there are other community benefits that trickle down from this, but we are really focused on healthy waterways. The multiple benefits come with this, whether you want them or not, because the other things trickle down. So the framework that we developed is meant to be complementary to and integrate into existing One Water planning frameworks. Our hope is that the results will be a plan that addresses community water supply, but also includes healthy waterways. And so with this work, we're taking a proactive approach to operationalizing One Water in service of healthy waterways, as well as in service of communities and their future drinking water supply. So next slide, please. Our report has many resources to guide you through the planning process. We broke our framework down into 4 steps, and I'm going to briefly go over the steps that we've developed. Please visit our website at texaslivingwaters.org to download the full report and to get all the great information we've compiled. Next slide, please. Step 1 is creating a community vision for healthy waterways. The creation of a community vision is a first step to safeguarding waterways. Water planners often come to the table with an established set of needs and challenges to be addressed. But with the effective engagement of communities, planners can establish a more complete scope of issues, benefits, and possible solutions. If both community advocates and environmental scientists are invited to the table, the resulting vision increases the likelihood that healthy waterway concerns will be identified and thus incorporated. It enhances the prospects for community acceptance of the plan and maximizes intersecting benefits to the community and especially impacted populations. For these reasons, we recommend the creation of a community vision based on an authentically collaborative stakeholder engagement process. The community vision is something that should get revisited throughout the planning process and can be used as a measuring stick to see if the plan is meeting the community goals. And also, it's a great way to communicate to decision makers about the context of the plan. You could start explaining the plan by saying, we have a vision, and this is how we're achieving it. We're going to go a little deeper into this element, Carrie is, after I go over the next 3 steps. Next slide, please. So step 2 is identifying the benefits and trade-offs of advancing waterways locally. Once a clear vision statement has been created with inputs from stakeholders, we move on to identifying the benefits and trade-offs of advancing healthy waterways. It's important that the desired benefits to healthy waterways be considered within the context of real external constraints, especially regulatory requirements. This can result in benefits to riparian and aquatic ecosystems, groundwater levels, local drinking water supply, energy generation and use, recreation, and more. Balancing these outcomes requires proactive consideration of how water supply projects can contribute to or impair achieving healthy waterway benefits. Here are a few examples of how expanded benefits can accrue from planning for healthy waterways. Water conservation measures that include benefits for stream flows can increase opportunities for water recreation. You can have flow protection strategies that also impact and benefit downstream water users. Proactive protection of at-risk ecosystems, even those that do not yet have regulatory protection, can minimize the potential for future regulatory impediments that may undermine water supply project yield or longevity. Next slide, Marianne. So step 3 is evaluating key benefits and trade-offs to healthy waterways. Once the benefits and constraints are identified and understood, the next step for consideration of healthy waterways involves a characterization of the impacts of the planned projects on waterways. A quantitative assessment is preferred, but if sufficient data are lacking, then a qualitative assessment should be done. Due to the complexity and variability of aquatic ecosystems, readily available environmental flow criteria, especially for individual streams, are in short supply. But as discussed in the Pacific Institute's Multi-Benefits Framework Guidebook, difficulty in assigning precise values should not result in ignoring a particular benefit or trade-off. A wide variety of key benefits and trade-offs likely will have been identified in step 3, and each will lend itself to a different level of quantification for comparison. The report that Sarah just described, there's a case study on that project in Austin. We were involved in helping with that too. It provides an example of using differing levels of quantification for a variety of benefits. It's real instructive to have a real world example on that, so that's a good place to look. In addition, our report provides lots of information and tools to help with this part of the process. This is the quote new part of the water supply planning process for many folks, and we acknowledge that it can be tricky, but it is possible to do, and we have attempted to provide a lot of resources and framework for folks to look at, and we're of course happy to be a resource as well. Next slide, Marianne. So the last step in our process is using the Healthy Waterways framework to inform decision making. Planners and stakeholders involved in the process should plan to communicate clear information about the options to the public and decision makers. Ideally, key decision makers and stakeholders will have been involved throughout the planning process and will help make the case to others on why the community's plans should be supported. Most plans ultimately have to be adopted by decision makers, so it's helpful to talk to them throughout the process, but step 4 is really about taking this to decision makers, making sure they understand how you got there and what you're going to achieve with this plan and getting them to accept it. So once a community's One Water plan is in place, the real work begins. The community vision and goals need to be clear and ever present as the plan moves forward to implementation and individual plan elements are developed. So I'm going to pass the mic over to Carrie Thompson now. She's going to take us on a deeper dive on public engagement. This is an important part of the process and is a thread that runs throughout creating and implementing your plan. Carrie?
Thanks, Jennifer. Marianne, next slide. Yeah, I think one of the maybe most surprising things we found as we talked to communities across the country was how important the public was in setting the tone for prioritizing ecosystems and healthy waterways. And we found a direct correlation, and cities told us that public engagement is what produced the vision for planning for the environment. And we've included in our publication some of these quotes out of people's vision statements or guiding principles. But you can see that these communities who turned to the public actually ended up with vision statements that explicitly call out the need to protect ecosystems. The other cities that we talked to who didn't use this type of approach found that their plans inadvertently excluded considerations for the environment because they were led by the vision of the water supply needs or the drive for efficiency or other priorities that were stated by their initial thought process when they originated their planning. Next slide. Actually, Marianne, can you progress a few slides to a purple table? It seems that we have one out of order, and I apologize to everyone. Get a little preview here. So I hope that and expect that most of you have been exposed to this spectrum of collaboration that's put out by IAP2. If you haven't been exposed to it, I encourage you to seek this resource out. There's some good information on the website. This is the International Association for Public Participation. And what this table does is kind of show you that there is a spectrum of how we work with the public. And a lot of agencies or public entities, in my opinion, unfortunately, can end up here on the left side of the table where they're just kind of telling the public what they're going to do. Sometimes they tell the public, here's some options. You want to weigh in, we'll look at what you have to say. But that is not public engagement at the scale that we think really affects change and the outcome of One Water planning. And so what we want to see communities do is move farther to the right end of this spectrum, ideally landing in the collaborating zone, or even at times in the empowerment zone. So what I want to do and spend a little time on today is give you a short course on kind of some of the components of true collaboration. And trying, I think for a lot of us, my background is in public service, and I've worked for both the state and federal government, and I know that it's really difficult to get our agencies sometimes to even go to the consultation level. But what we're calling for in this work and what we learned from the communities who have successfully engaged their communities in their One Water plans and achieved outcomes for healthy ecosystems is that they went all the way over to collaborate. They turned to their community and truly said, work alongside of us and let's envision this together. So I want to give you some kind of tips and tricks to think about what moves you from just involving or notifying the public over to collaborating with the public. So if we could go back, there are two kind of key components when I think about how to take engagement from involvement to collaborating with the public. And when I teach collaborative process, these are the core concepts. And we didn't go into detail in the paper on this, but it's actually the kind of the background that informs some of the tips and tricks that we included in the document. So the first important part is what needs to drive your process is trying to understand the interests of the public. And then secondly, you want to make sure that your process is received as legitimate. And there are some key components that studies and experience show really add legitimacy, create legitimacy in an engagement process. So we'll spend some time on that. Next slide. So for those of you who haven't encountered this concept of interest, I just wanted to give a simple example. Typically when you ask, if you ask your family what you want to do for the evening, you'll get a list of positions. I want to go to dinner. I want to, go on a walk in the park, whatever. Those are positions that are just very simple. They're very unidirectional. They offer only one way to satisfy that request. If you say, I want to go to dinner, then I'm going to take you to dinner, right? The example in a water example might be, I'm against a water treatment facility. I don't want to see it get built because it'll be ugly, right? That's a position. What we really want to try to understand, and we want to build process to understand, is what are the interests that motivate that position. You can solve the problem of something being ugly, but that may not actually address the person's dissatisfaction. So an interest is kind of what is behind the reason that you have that position. And it addresses needs, desires, and concerns. And it gives it, what's really cool about discovering what the true underlying interest is it really opens a lot of avenues to addressing those things. So the example here is that it's important to me that this river look like the river that I grew up on. So maybe the initial position was, I don't want that facility built here, it's ugly. But the real driver for that person is, I want that river to look like the river I grew up on. And then you can dig deeper and think, okay, well, this person cares about heritage. This person cares about being in nature. This, whatever those values are, you can start speaking to those values, and it's going to help you arrive at a variety of solutions that really provide lasting satisfaction, not just kind of a quick fix. The challenging part of driving for interest is that a lot of times we don't even know our own interests. So when I say to my partner that I want to go out to dinner, maybe I really just want some private time with my partner. Maybe it's not about the dinner at all, right? So it's uncovering that deeper drive, and so that you have a variety of ways to come at a problem. And I'm happy to field some questions on that. We'll go to the next concept, and we'll spend the most time on this one. I encountered this triangle of satisfaction, and I found it to be one of the best tools for thinking about how to structure a collaborative process. And the credit here is for CDR Associates, and you can look them up. They're very respected in this field. But this model is it goes deep. So I want to show you some different ways to look at it. But basically what it says is that to create a successful process, you have to address some basic needs of a group. So any group that you're working in is going to have this kind of triangle of needs. One need is for clear procedure. How are you going to be governed? Another need is trust and safety, and kind of relationships within the group. And then that third side is the substance. What's the information that is needed to solve or address problems, or work towards your objective. And then a balance of those creates that sort of group of options that really satisfy needs and leave people feeling like the process was legitimate, the outcomes are legitimate. And what's interesting about that is sometimes the outcomes don't really matter that much if people feel like the process was fair and the process was legitimate. So it's a shift of trying to satisfy all of the voices to trying to build a legitimate and fair process. So let's go through some different scenarios here, and I'll explain each of these a little more in the next slide. So some examples of the procedural side, or kind of when you're thinking about a process and how you're going to set it up, you need to make sure you're answering all of these questions and giving people the information about where do they sit in the universe of this process. How are you going to make decisions? What steps have to happen? What kind of information am I going to be privy to? Who's going to get to vote? Just kind of the who, what, where, when, why stuff. That's that procedure. And And that even, you know, that last bullet there, where do we sit, is actually a pretty powerful and important question. So really giving some thoughtfulness to the process and then being really clear and open about what that process is. Next slide. The substance part, I also call this part data. In our world, with, you know, all the scientific inputs and technical inputs that we have, especially when you're talking about engineering a one water plan, it's very complex. And so you need to be really clear about what are the questions you'll be answering, and then how do you get that data? What do you need to have to make the decision? How are you going to get that information? And is everybody comfortable with the source of that information? So this parameter actually can be its own process, depending on the complexity of your issue. So, for example, if you have a planning process where you need engineering and biology and hydrology, you know, and then maybe some of those things are contentious in your area, you may have to be really thoughtful about who's providing that data, and the process for getting that data may even have to be vetted in its own process. So this is that piece of like, what do you need to make the decisions, and in a way that everyone feels like it's been fair. And then finally, next slide, is the relationship. You know, are people being respectful to each other? Can you trust each other? And, you know, most importantly, do people feel safe to fully participate and engage? Are their ideas truly welcome? So I want to show you some scenarios and kind of how you use this triangle. Next slide. So I put a scenario in for each one. I think what's really powerful about this, and has been powerful for me, is you know, as you come into a situation and you assess your own situation, this is a real amazing guide to kind of what you need to focus on to build a collaborative environment. So here's a scenario where we're kind of low on substance, right? So the triangle is showing us that we're low on the data. So a scenario might be, maybe you're going to try to plan at a watershed scale for the first time. You don't even know what that scale is going to be yet. You don't know exactly what the planning area is going to be. You don't know the priorities, because you're bringing several communities together that maybe haven't had to plan together before. So you have low information at this point. So what you do when you bring this group together is you really focus on the ground rules, and you focus on establishing trust while you gather that information. And so that's how this tool is helpful for me anyway, in thinking about how to create those environments. So let me give you another example. Next slide. This one's where maybe you have a situation where there's a very low trust. You know, this scenario is a one water plan is initiated in a community where there's a history of water contamination that was blamed on the utility. So you're coming into a process where you want stakeholders to weigh in. They don't trust you, they don't trust each other. Then you really need to invest some time in getting the group to engage on shared vision for governance, and then maybe have them focus on fact finding together. You know, that substance, have them engage in pulling the data together. And while you're working on those things, the trust will be growing and the relationships will be forming and developing. And ideally, all of these legs are going to even out over time. But this just tells you, you know, hey, it's okay to be weak on one side here. You work to your strengths, and it's going to bolster the other aspect. And then finally, the last scenario is maybe there's a city plan that's initiated during an election year. We actually encountered this with a couple of the cities we talked to in our assessment last year. The city staff had, you know, total excitement and focus on one water planning, but they didn't see that their current mayor was that invested or even reachable. So maybe there's this situation where you want to get started, but you don't have the governance very clear. You don't know who the decision makers are going to be. You don't know if you're going to have the buy-in, but you could go ahead and start investing in a process and building relationships with stakeholders and investing in that data collection. So just a kind of another example where you're still moving forward and you're able to kind of start building legitimacy even if all the pieces aren't there yet. Next slide. So what we've done in the document, I hope you all will take some time to read through it. We've given some pointers in the Appendix A on some of the kind of just ideas to support these needs that the triangle kind of highlights. We categorize them as sort of access to the process, how do you structure it, how do you build trust, and that information piece. I think one of the challenges a lot of us have, and we're discovering now collectively across the country, is that historic inequities have really set us up to need to do even more work to make sure that the engagement that we're attempting to do is inclusive and in some cases needs to address some historic damage. So hopefully these are going to be helpful tips. It's not conclusive, but I think hopefully they'll give you a good start. And then the next slide. Oh, next one. After that, we just kind of want to, wrap it up and talk about that we hope that the outcomes of using the framework are, we hope we've given you some good tools. One of the things that we've found and is maybe obvious, and of course was in the vision of One Water planning, is that healthy waterways are a part of One Water, but we also found that there needs to be just a slight shift in intentionality to make that happen. We also think you'll realize using the framework that you can realize multiple benefits from doing this type of planning. Those benefits may be focused on healthy waterways, but as Sarah mentioned, they can actually span into many other realms and may not require that much more expenditure of resources, but you could really see expansive payoff. And then I think the other point of engaging with the community is that good planning helps you avoid unintended consequences and those future regulatory issues. So by broadening the scope and including ecosystems and watershed thinking, hopefully you're also going to be saving money and time, resources, and avoiding future regulatory issues. And of course, adaptive management and continued learning is always going to be part of this. Next slide. So Jennifer, I don't know if you want to speak to what's next.
Yeah. So thanks a lot, Carrie. So the One Water planning framework that we've presented today, it's not new, but we think that the inclusion of the specific guidance on how to incorporate healthy waterways is. And as cities across the U.S. embrace One Water, we hope that they will continue to consider incorporating the framework that we've presented today. Because after all, meeting community and ecosystem needs is one of the pillars of One Water. And with this report, we're providing a pathway to achieve that goal. What we kept hearing over and over again was defining the waterways and measuring and thinking about how we're going to proactively incorporate this into the planning process was hard. The desire was there, but there wasn't a pathway. So we're hoping that this is helpful to communities as we move forward. So we invite communities to include these concepts in their planning efforts, and we're happy to work with you as you do so. We definitely don't have all the answers. We've all been involved in some planning processes and are applying our knowledge to this, but we'd like to, be a resource and learn with you as we go. Next slide, Marianne. So I want to thank you all for your time today. We encourage you to visit our website, texaslivingwaters.org, to download a copy of the report. Feel free to reach out to myself and Carrie and Sarah, and we'll be happy to talk with you all about this. We have been doing webinars. We've been preparing blog posts for folks that want to send it out that are maybe wholesale water providers or work with a group of water providers. We can prepare some written material, and we can also talk to you about your process locally in your community as well. And we'd love to hear feedback as well. But I believe we have turn it over to Mary Ann, and we have time for some questions now, if there are any.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, Sarah, and Carrie, for a great webinar presentation. And I want to thank the attendees for joining us. If you've got questions, type them in that question box and we will answer them now. If your question hasn't been answered due to time constraints, we'll go as long as we can. Here's Liam's email. Liam is our webinar master, and he will get you an answer if we don't answer it today. A PDF of the presentation and a link for the webinar recording will be available in a few days. We'll send you an email when they're ready. And again, sign up for the Water and Planning Network. We've got an email list. We'd love to add you. So just send your information to water@planning.org. So Liam, what do we have for questions?
All right, thanks, Mary Ann. First question from the very beginning of the presentation. How do you define a community benefit? What were they specifically?
This is Sarah. I can take that one. So at least for the multi-benefit framework, we had a kind of a wide range of community benefits, and we tried actually to be very open and not try to define them too narrowly. As Carrie talked through, this idea and this need for public engagement really should be what guides then those community benefits. In terms of some of the analyses we've done, like the stormwater one that I showed you, each individual project defined what was a community benefit. Some of it was changes to aesthetics, property values. Some of them were availability of local jobs. So the metric that you choose can be different for a wide variety of projects. And as Carrie and Jennifer both mentioned, working through this process and creating a vision can help with determining, how do we define community benefits in this context. So rather than having Pacific Institute or having National Wildlife Federation or having someone else define those community benefits for you, it's more about in your own community and your own application.
Okay, thank you. Next question. How do you address the issue that different audiences and interest groups use different language that may not translate well for other communities of practice, hampering communication and good interaction?
Carrie, do you want to take that one? That sounds like something you probably have experience with.
Yeah, sure. Liam, can you read it again? There's a lot there.
Sure. How do you address the issue that different audiences and interest groups use different language that may not translate well for other communities of practice, hampering communication and good interaction?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. It's pretty complex. So I'll just throw a few things out and tell me, I guess, if this isn't hitting the mark. But there are a couple of techniques. I mean, there are many techniques, of course. I think one of the tips we have included in the appendix is be flexible about how you get information. I think in the public sector, a lot of us are, we feel kind of boxed in that we need to be absolutely equitable in how we approach things. And so, for instance, we put out a call for comments and we only take those comments, or we put out flip charts at a meeting and we only take the things that end up on the flip chart. And I think one of the lessons of trying to work across diverse communities is you need to work within the comfort space of that community. And so those flip charts might be perfect for part of your community and they may be useless in another part. So be flexible about how you take information. Feedback is valid in all of its forms. And so one of the messages we've tried to put forward is meet them where they are, both physically, but also intellectually and culturally. So if you have a community that is more informal and uses storytelling, maybe you set up a meeting that facilitates storytelling and is more intimate and is in a space that's comfortable for that aspect of the community. You don't have to have a venue that suits all comers. You can customize, you can create work groups and focus groups. You can, I think one of the neatest things to do if you do want to kind of have everybody end up working together on the same page, And one of the things you'll encounter in this literature is creating a learning environment where everyone's learning together. So you don't come in as the planner or the scientist and say, I want you guys to all get up to speed on this hydrograph. You facilitate the group to ask the questions that they need to have answered. And then you go on a learning quest together to get that information. And maybe that's field trips, maybe that's, you know, letting people tell you their experience and in a way that makes sense to them. And then you use kind of active listening to reflect back and confirm your own understanding of what you're being told. So I'm sure that that's not hitting the exact mark, but those are some thoughts.
And I'll say too, I'll just add to that, this is Jennifer. We initially really struggled with even how to describe this concept, because while it was clear to Carrie and Sarah and myself, once we started telling people outside of our little circle about it, we got some real quizzical looks, because we were talking about environmental benefit and environmental flow and all this. And I think it's still a little bit of a complicated concept, but we really had to think about it and think about how we're describing this in healthy waterways, which hopefully is a little bit more descriptive than environmental benefit to folks. Like, it's just the words that we choose to use to talk about this, what is a pretty complicated concept. Like, we've had to struggle with that as well. And hopefully we're hitting the mark now, but you know, it's not a, you know, immediately clear process sometimes.
Yeah, and Liam, one more thing I would just say, this is very simple, but I find it to be helpful, is really focus on that root of the word of collaborate is co-labor. So you planners, your technical staff, your administrative folks, your policy people, you are there at the table co-laboring. It's not you asking in a unidirectional format. Everyone's pulled up to the table to try to learn from each other and learn and labor together through the problem.
Okay, we're coming up about to the top of the hour, and I'd like to still, I know, Liam, we've got a lot more questions, so let's try and go a little 5 minutes beyond, if that's all right with everyone. I'd like to try and get as many questions in as we possibly can.
All right, sounds good. So moving along to the next question. Often watershed boundaries do not overlap with municipal boundaries or scales at which planners work. In your research, what strategies have you found that work well to promote regional or cross-boundary community collaboration for healthy waterways?
This is Jennifer. You're correct. That's a very astute observation. One of the things that we suggest is to think about geography and to think about watershed, and thinking about this collaborative process at the beginning and vision setting. Sorry, can't get that out. One of the steps or things to consider with that is your geographic scope. And then we suggest inviting some stakeholders that maybe don't live in the exact water supply area, your municipality that's actually doing this planning, but to invite some stakeholders either further up in the watershed or downstream, or some agricultural interests, people that aren't directly like getting water out of the tap of the water that you serve, but are impacted by these water management decisions and can also provide some input. It's different for every community, because every community looks really different, both from a community makeup, but also ecologically and geographically. But we encourage you to think expansively and to involve different jurisdictions where possible. I don't know if Sarah has anything to add to that, or Carrie.
Okay, let's move to the next question.
Okay. How early would you bring in regulators to discuss ideas?
Well, this is Carrie, and I guess I don't know if, Marianne, if you could scroll back to the 4 steps If you want to just put those up, it's kind of midway in the presentation. But I would just say, if you do refer to the framework, these first two steps, I think of these as kind of the dreaming phase, right? The second two, last two are more delivery, right? And that's my own frame on that. But I think these first steps, creating a vision, you absolutely want to include or at least be aware of potential regulatory constraints. Step two, that in the framework, actually, you're very explicitly thinking about those regulations. But as a former regulator, I'll say the earlier the better. I think those folks can actually help generate ideas. Maybe that's just to you as a staff or as the planning team. I don't advise putting the regulators in the room with the community in the beginning, because you really want to facilitate a dreaming, right? You want to think about all of those things you want to see in the community. As Sarah talked about the multi-benefit framework, you want the ideas to flow. You don't want them to be constrained by like, oh, I'd love to see this, but we have this water quality issue. That's step two. You want to put that off, or even step three. You really want to be generating the dream, doing that dreaming in the first stages. So planners, administrators, know your regulations, be talking to your regulators, but let the community be free to dream. And at least in those visionary stages, don't be constrained by your perception of the regulations.
All right, thank you. Next question. With your work in the water industry, do you notice any trends related to strengths and weaknesses on the engagement triangle?
Oh my, I love this question. Sorry, Jennifer, do you want to take that? Or?
No, go ahead.
Okay, because I obviously care deeply about the triangle. So let me just say, data, the substantive part, is really where things are changing. And I know this is not news to any of you, but if we had this talk 10 years ago, we probably would have said, have an expert panel. We would have said, turn to your experts. That doesn't work anymore. Expertise is no longer a guaranteed accepted practice. So coming up with science that people see as valid is its own process now. So I think there is extra work that has to go into bringing data to the table that is seen as legitimate, and you will have to do extra work to make sure that your science is untouchable, that your data is not questioned, and so that your decisions are not questioned. So I would say that has changed dramatically in the last decade, and even in the last few years, even more.
And I would say that there is an increased emphasis on stakeholders and how do we get different kinds of stakeholders to the table. I've shown up to water planning processes and other kinds of just policy-driven things in Texas for many, many years, and there's a rotating cast of people there, but many of them are familiar, and there's a big emphasis on getting beyond that bubble. I don't have all the answers for how to do that, and we're struggling with that, but I think that it's an expectation that folks are having, and it's also gonna have us as planners and policymakers and people who think we know a lot of the answers about how to do this, challenge those assumptions as we get feedback from folks that aren't traditionally involved in these processes. And we're going to have to make it work for them so we can actually communicate with them too. I thought Carrie's example at the beginning of her section was really good, beginning beyond from positions to interests.
Okay, next question. How do you include Indigenous, Native, and place-based knowledge into this framework? Was that something explicitly considered?
We didn't specifically address it. Some of the pointers in Appendix A definitely apply there, and were meant to apply to all communities. Those That's a great question, and it does take a specialized approach. And but in my view, and I'm sure I could speak for Jennifer and Sarah, that information, that data is as important as any other, and needs to have its way into consideration. So, like many communities, will require a specialized approach.
Let's do 2 more questions, Liam.
All right. Should a watershed-wide climate study be helpful in the planning process and seeing effects on water quality from climate change?
I would say yes. Any kind of studies that you can get that inform your water planning process should be undertaken, but that shouldn't be a limiting factor if you can't do it. For the plan that we did in Austin, our water forward plan, we did a climate analysis. The city of Austin did that, and it was based on water supply impacts. I think that water supply impacts are obviously connected to water quality impacts, and you could either like take a plan like that and extrapolate it out, or you could look specifically at water quality impacts and try to plan for and mitigate those. We want folks to do as much as they can to try to understand the environmental context within which they're planning, both now and in the future, and to try to anticipate impacts, both good and bad. But we also don't want it to be a limiting factor that stops forward movement. I think, like we said, quantitative data is great. Qualitative data is second to that, and we have a lot of professional judgment we can use. We also have all these wonderful stakeholders and local experience, and we talk about in our, I think it's Appendix B, where we talk about a bunch of tools. One of them is talking to people that have lived in and along these waterways for a long time. You can get so much information from those folks. That's a legitimate tool if you don't have these other things. So yes, I would say get the climate data if you can, but don't let it stop you from moving forward.
All right, and one more question. How do you balance qualitative versus quantitative approaches, especially in an intense regulatory environment?
Sarah, do you want to do that one since you'll talk about it?
Sure, I can take a first crack at it. I mean, it's such an important question, and I think it's going to be a challenge. One of the things for this framework, as well as the larger multi-benefit framework, I mean, we thought about a lot, was that different decision makers will need different levels of information, and so it's important to know what level that decision maker needs. So for regulatory for regulatory entities, they're often going to need a more quantitative data set. And that's fine, and that's something that you just have to build into how you're doing these analyses. But on the other hand, we don't want to then minimize the benefits that are maybe more qualitative, and especially these end up being some of the social benefits. And so part of the planning process needs to be then that benefit identification before we worry about quantitative versus qualitative, and laying those all on and level footing and equal playing field, so that then once we start putting metrics and indicators on it, there isn't this, we don't start losing all of the benefits that we can't quantify. And so, so I think it is this challenge. It's building a decision-making process that can accommodate both those things, but really knowing what decision makers need to see and providing them with that level of information whenever it's possible.
Well, I want to thank very much Jennifer Walker, Sarah Dieringer, Carrie Thompson for a fabulous presentation today. And we hope to answer any unanswered questions that you have typed in that we couldn't get to today. We'll try and get answers to you by email. So apologies that we couldn't get to all the questions today, but there's clearly a lot of interest in this topic, and we thank all 3 of you for a fabulous presentation. And thanks to all of our attendees for joining. I see by my email I've gotten some signups already for the Water and Planning Network email list, so keep them coming. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you.